Here's the opening paragraph of Wikipedia's entry on the scientific opinion of astrology. There's a lot to unpack. For example, have a look at this third sentence. Scientific testing has found no evidence. No evidence. None at all? I mean, that statement seems kind of suspect to me because in my personal experience, I find evidence in favor of astrology all the time. Sure, that's anecdotal, but also I seem to have heard of several formal tests having been done. But maybe the rest of the article will clarify what they're talking about. Let's just have a glance at the second sentence. Astrology has been rejected by the scientific community. Really? Has it? The whole community? Well, I'm sure Wikipedia is talking about the modern scientific community because almost everyone knows that almost every ancient or classical scientist literally was an astrologer. But even if we limit it to the modern scientific community, is it really accurate to say that the entire modern scientific community rejects astrology? How about people like Carl Jung? There's another weird thing about this second sentence, though. It says that astrology has been rejected by the scientific community as having no explanatory power for describing the universe. None. Are you sure about that? I mean, zodiacal coordinates are used to this day to aim telescopes and calculate trajectories of spacecraft. So even if that's the only thing that astrology has really given us, it's still not factual to say that astrology literally contributes nothing to our descriptions of the universe. But the real elephant in the room in this paragraph is really this first sentence. Astrology consists of a number of belief systems that hold that there is a relationship between astronomical phenomena and events or descriptions of personality in the human world. So in other words, the idea that there's a relationship between the heavens and human events is an irrational belief, not a scientific idea, right? Okay, well, here's an astrological event. It's called the sun is in Cancer. Am I to understand that this literally has no relationship at all to what human beings are doing here at Jones Beach? Okay, here's another astrological event. The sun is in Capricorn. So this has no relationship at all to what these humans are experiencing here on the Long Island Expressway. So in fact, it seems pretty blatantly obvious that there is a relationship between celestial conditions and human affairs. But the real question is, what kind of relationship? There are two important types of relationships we should consider here: causal and indicative. In a causal relationship, one thing causes another. And in an indicative relationship, one thing indicates another. Heat causes fire, for example. So the relationship between them is causal. Heat causes fire. Smoke doesn't cause fire, it indicates fire. So the relationship between smoke and fire is indicative. Now, which one of these two models describes the relationship that astrology posits between celestial events and human events? This is a very, very important question, because your answer to this question will determine whether the ridicule that astrology gets from science is deserved or undeserved. Now, it's tempting to say that there's a causal relationship between the heavens and humanity. After all, the sun goes into Cancer and a chain of events gets set into motions that sends human beings flocking to Jones Beach. Or the sun rises in the morning and human beings wake up. But while this is scientifically defensible for simple positions of the sun and basic daily and annual patterns of humanity as a general whole, it becomes much less defensible the more we try to explain specific decisions and specific actions of specific individuals. Also, while it's defensible for the sun, since the sun's effect on the earth is so massive and overwhelming, it starts to become difficult to defend when we bring the moon into the picture, and it entirely breaks down when we bring in the planets. The literal causative effect of Saturn upon a human being is empirically non-demonstrable. And if astrology wants to just ignore that, well, then it has earned its ridicule. Faced with this situation, astrology fans either retreat into the closet or they boldly declare science to be irrelevant or a hoax. But I have very good news for you. Astrology does not need the causal model. There's another option, the indicative model, the proposal that the heavens indicate human affairs like smoke indicating fire. And what's really interesting about this good news is that this was the original concept of astrology. It wasn't until this 2nd century scientist, Claudius Ptolemy, that astrologers began to adopt a causal model. Previous to him, almost no astrologer would propose that the planets have some direct causal effect on human life. Instead, everyone agreed that the shape of the sky indicated earthly conditions and human affairs. And it did so by acting as a universal timestamp, a code which could be utilized to infer how the past was evolving into the present and how the present would evolve into the future. If you would like to know more about this model of astrology, please read The Beautifully Rational Philosophy of Astrology. The link to this book is in the description below. Now, why did Ptolemy introduce a causal model into astrology? Well, in Ptolemy's world, the hard sciences like physics, which deal with direct causalities, these rapidly started to become more and more successful and thus more and more prestigious. And Ptolemy wanted astronomy to share their status and prestige. And so the irony of his failure is really quite poignant. In trying to class astrology with the hard sciences, he wound up turning it into a donkey for their ridicule. Because the developments in the hard sciences over the centuries since his time have only made it perfectly clear that there simply are no direct empirical causalities between the distant planets and your love life. Now, to make matters even worse, not only did Ptolemy turn astrology into a donkey for scientific ridicule, he did so at the cost of sacrificing its respect among logicians and philosophers as well. Because his theory amounted to fatalistic determinism in which human agency played no significant role. Now, modern scientists, they usually don't care enough about astrology to find out any of this. They just assume that the post-Ptolemaic causal model is the only model of astrology, and then they proceed to rip it to shreds. Unfortunately, most fans and even many practitioners of astrology are also unaware that the causal model was a blunder inflicted upon us by Ptolemy, and that the original astrological conceptions are philosophically and logically sound and do not defy any modern empirical sciences. Again, if you want to understand that in very clear detail, then I highly recommend this book, The Beautifully Rational Philosophy of Astrology. The link is below. So I will see you soon for episode 2 of this series, where we will unpack the rest of what Wikipedia has to say on the subject of science and astrology. Continuing from episode 1, we hear Wikipedia's article, Astrology and Science, say, quote, "Where astrology has made falsifiable predictions, it has been falsified." Falsifiable simply means that something can be proven false. This is a very useful concept, actually, because there are many things that we can't prove true, but we can prove aren't false. So, for example, you can't prove that all swans are white, because how could you possibly ever see all swans? But as long as you're observing swans and not seeing one that isn't white, then you haven't falsified the statement that all swans are white. So knowing that a statement is not false is functionally or basically almost the same as knowing that it is true. Now, to falsify this statement, All we have to do is see one single black swan. This logical methodology, which is very useful, was formulated by Karl Popper, who, by the way, is a very outspoken critic of astrology. So this method only works on statements that are possible to disprove. So it works best with tangible and objective things like the color of a swan. And it doesn't work so well with intangible or subjective things like a statement that swans tend to be happy on Sundays. So now that we know this, let's return to this statement, quote, where astrology has made falsifiable predictions, it has been falsified. What does that actually mean? It means this, quote, astrologers usually make statements that are impossible to disprove. But whenever they do make a disprovable statement, it turns out to be false. Ironically, the statement itself is blatantly falsifiable and falsified. Even a single clear predictive interpretation from even a single astrologer would be the black swan that falsifies this claim. Now, astrologers certainly make inaccurate predictions and interpretations, but I think it's safe to say that we have sometimes made accurate predictions at least once. So to even be a candidate for accuracy, this statement in Wikipedia has to be edited so that it does not imply that all astrological predictions that are falsifiable have been proven false. Now, Wikipedia continues. The most famous test was headed by Sean Carlson and included a committee of scientists and a committee of astrologers. It led to the conclusion that natal astrology performed no better than chance. In case you don't know, in 1985, Sean Carlson conducted 2 experiments to evaluate the accuracy of astrology. In the first experiment, the birth data of 193 test subjects was given to about 24 astrologers, who then provided interpretations of the birth data. Each test subject was then shown 3 of those interpretations, and they were asked to pick which one of those 3 was in fact their interpretation. In the second experiment, these test subjects first completed a California psychological inventory test, and then 3 of those test results were given to each astrologer along with 1 birth data. And the astrologer was asked to select which of the test results came from the person whose birth data they had. According to the published results, both experiments indicated that astrology performed no better than random chance guessing. Now, Wikipedia is directly implying that this Carlson test was a test of falsifiability. But was it? No. Let me give you some examples of falsifiable experiments. Make an experiment where astrologers have to predict the number of children that were born to 100 postmenopausal women. Or astrologers have to predict the height of 100 middle-aged people. Or astrologers have to predict the age of death of 100 deceased people. What all of these have in common is that the astrologers' predictions are simple, numerical facts. This makes them falsifiable. Sean Carlson's test of astrology, however, did not deal with any simple falsifiable empirical metric. Asking someone to select their own interpretation is highly subjective. I know I would certainly have strong biases if you asked me to select my own interpretation. I would definitely favor the interpretation that I want to be mine. The second part of the experiment also lacks empirical metrics and instead works with complex and subjective things. It might be as much an evaluation of the California Psychological Inventory, or certainly it's really a test of how compatible the 2 systems are for this particular set of participants. Carlson's test was not so much a scientific experiment as it was an open challenge to astrology. And astrology failed this challenge, probably because the participants were not practiced enough in astrology or science to realize just how poorly constructed the experiment was and just how much variability was left uncontrolled and subject to chance. Next, the Wikipedia article states, quote, astrology has not demonstrated its effectiveness in controlled studies and has no scientific validity and is thus regarded as pseudoscience. Okay, let's talk about controlled studies first of all. The first problem with any such study is that the person who's constructing the study would need to be fluently practiced in both scientific methodology and astrological practice. Without being an actual scientist, they would simply not know how to conduct a real scientific experiment. And without being an actual astrologer, they would be unaware of the variables involved in astrological prediction. These variables are of paramount importance because every variable possible must be accounted for and explicitly controlled in any valid scientific experiment. In short, it would take a scientific and astrological genius to devise an experiment that would truly and conclusively prove or disprove the validity of astrology. And in this, is astrology any different from any other science? No. In every science, the difficult part is figuring out how to conduct the experiment to derive the proof. The scientists who are praised and remembered are those who did exactly that. So why is it that when it comes to astrology, the scientific community suddenly does a 180 and instead praises people who design experiments that fail? The challenges to creating a truly accurate astrological experiment come from both sides of the issue, the scientific side and the astrological side. The scientific community simply doesn't care enough about astrology to support any of its members in devoting the time and energy required to understand astrology sufficiently enough to test it. And also the astrological community is unwilling and unable to devote all the time and energy required to such an endeavor mostly because overall it really doesn't care enough about logic and science. How difficult would it be to devise a truly effective astrological experiment? Well, for any experiment to be scientific, the things that you do in this experiment have to be explicitly defined so that they can be exactly repeated each time. Just like any significant physics experiment requires a mastermind of physics, it will take an astrological mastermind to derive such a methodology for any astrological experiment. For example, if we want to test whether astrology can accurately predict how many children a woman will have, can it be done just by knowing her sun sign? I think any astrologer would immediately agree that it's impossible to do so with any efficiency better than random chance. So does this disprove astrology? Maybe, but more likely it just shows you that you need a more rigorous methodology than just the sun sign. Well, what kind of methodology? Well, here's some examples. What planets occupy the fifth sign? What conditions are they in? What planets are influencing them? What are the conditions and influences on the first lord? What are the conditions and influences on Jupiter? And also, very importantly, the fifth sign from what? From the ascendant, from the moon, from the fifth lord, from all of the above? And also, should we include these same factors in the zodiacal subdivisions? And if so, which ones? Now, this looks like a pretty exhaustive list, but to support this list, we need backup definitions as well. We also have to define things like planetary conditions and planetary influences. How are those calculated? How are those assessed? And deeper still, there's more problems that have to be defined before an experiment can proceed to step one. Like, for example, what's a planet? Which planets are we going to use? What's a zodiac? Which concept of a zodiac will we use? What's a house? Which house concept will we use? What kind of schools of interpretation will we use? Now open a new Pandora's box. Do we need to consider the astrological chart of this woman's mate or mates? Now this is just a quick gloss to give you an idea of how many astrological variables are involved in making an apparently clear-cut and simple prediction. Once all that work is done, and all of these variables are explicitly defined in mathematically calculable ways, Then an accurate test sample of sufficient size can be subjected to those calculations. The experimenter can then experiment to finally wind up with a methodology that produces the greatest accuracy in the results. So finally, when all that is done, then we compare that level of accuracy with something like the level of accuracy of just a random guess. And the gap in between the two defines the efficacy of astrology. And so how good is good enough? Now, no science is 100% perfect. And many very useful sciences are a lot less than 100% perfect. For example, physics can't tell us where an electron is at any given moment. Hey, physics can't even tell us what an electron is at any given moment. So does that mean physics is pseudoscience and that we're illiterate suckers getting scammed whenever we buy electricity for our homes? No. Another example is meteorology. It just doesn't predict the weather very well, especially not very far in advance, and especially not for very significant events like tornadoes and hurricanes and so forth. How about geology? Geologists, they don't predict earthquakes very well. Mudslides, those are really important things. How about medicine? Doctors, they don't always diagnose patients correctly. They can't cure every illness. So does that mean that meteorology, geology, and modern medicine are just pseudosciences and hoax? No, it just means that the sciences are imperfect and their practitioners are imperfect. And bear in mind, please, that these fields, like physics and medicine and so forth, have gigantic financial and social backing and support for their research and development. Compare that to astrology, which frankly operates on a shoestring and some kind donations. So suppose that somehow I manage to devise an experiment that will predict the number of children a woman has with exact accuracy 20% of the time. Is that good? No? Okay, how about 25%? 50%? Is that good enough to prove whatever it is that astrology's critics want us to prove? Early in my career as an astrologer, a Swiss nuclear physicist came to me for a reading. Is my husband's life in danger? She asked me. I replied, yes. You should be careful of internal bleeding, and it might result from falling from a high place. She was very angry and replied right away, this just confirms what I already knew. Astrology is a hoax. You didn't even realize that my husband is already dead. He died last month. How did he die? Internal bleeding while hiking in the mountains. Let's say someone, somewhere, somehow, someday performs a miracle and devises a methodology that will accurately predict the number of children a woman will have 90% of the time. Would that prove that astrology is a valid science? Well, it would be extremely impressive for sure. And it would certainly prove the genius of that particular astrologer and of that particular astrological method. But an honest logician and scientist would have to admit that it would still only be an indirect validation of astrology as a science. So if we want to conclusively know whether astrology is a science or is a pseudoscience, wouldn't it be better to simply look at the hypothesis of astrology itself and rationally judge whether it is plausible? Yes, it would be. And guess what? That's exactly what Wikipedia is going to bring up in its next sentence. And that's what we're going to explore in our next episode of Astrology versus Science. Episode 3 of Astrology versus Science. Do the planets affect us? So now you have to deal with the knockout punch. This is the punch that I told you to watch out for back in episode 1. In that episode, I explained that if astrology uses a causal model to rationalize its validity, then science is going to rip it to shreds. And here is the shredder quote. There is no proposed mechanism of action by which the positions and motions of stars and planets could affect people and events on Earth in the way that astrologers say they do, that does not contradict well understood basic aspects of biology and physics. So before we try to deal with this critique, let's make sure we understand it. First of all, what is a proposed mechanism? Well, a mechanism basically is a machine. And a machine basically is a series of parts that affect each other to produce some kind of output. So you turn one thing, and that turns the next thing a little bit more, and then that thing turns the third thing even more, and your bicycle moves happily forward. Sciences like physics are called mechanistic because they assume that the world functions like a machine. And this is a reasonable assumption. Krishna himself expresses the same point of view, yantrarudhani maya. So it's not like science is some evil thing. So now what's a mechanistic proposal? It's a proposal about how specific parts of the world work. Gravity, for example, is a mechanistic proposal that explains how things fall, or in other words, how objects are drawn towards larger objects. Inertia is another mechanistic proposal. That one explains motion. Now that we know what a mechanistic proposal is, the next important thing is to understand that not all proposals are valid. Science would accept a proposed mechanism as a valid mechanism only if it can demonstrate its validity. It has to prove that it works. How do you prove that a model works? You make accurate predictions with it. For example, we accept gravity as a valid mechanism because it can predict the way a thing will fall. And if you test it out, the thing actually falls that way. So when you get this quote, there is no proposed mechanism by which the positions and motions of stars and planets could affect people and events on Earth in the way that astrologers say they do. What do they mean? They mean that there is no explanation for how the location of, say, Saturn could mechanistically cause a particular person to be very pessimistic or very tenacious or whatever it is that Saturn is supposed to do. Now you say, wait, I've heard people explain ways that the planets could affect us on Earth. So yeah, the problem isn't that people haven't proposed mechanisms to explain how the planets can affect us on Earth. I mean, the person who invented the whole idea in the first place told me proposed a mechanism for it. The problem is that his proposal and all the others that have followed it aren't any good when they're put to empirical and logical test. So what is Ptolemy's proposal? Basically, he suggests that the planets emit some kind of energy, and that energy interacts with the Earth. And then that affects the weather, and then that affects the natural world, and then that affects human behavior and events. So it sounds sort of plausible, but the problem is that neither Ptolemy nor anybody who has followed him has ever explained exactly what this energy is. And so it could never be verified. Some people say it's gravity. Well, Carl Sagan famously ripped that idea to shreds in his Cosmos television series. One significant problem is that gravity doesn't directly affect human behavior. Gravity affects how objects are drawn towards each other. And you're going to have to explain a whole lot of steps to get from objects being pulled towards each other to what kind of person you want to fall in love with. And each one of those steps is going to have to be rational and then empirically demonstrated to be true with experiments. Not only that, but another problem with this proposal is that it also violates astrological principles. For example, Saturn's gravitational effect on the Earth doesn't change over the course of a day. But astrological interpretations of Saturn's effect on people changes dramatically over the course of the day because all the houses change. Another problem with this theory is that Saturn's gravitational effect on the Earth is microscopic, especially compared to the sun's, which is enormous. Yet in horoscopes, Saturn can easily be as important or more important than the sun in a particular chart. So if we say, okay, it's not gravity, it's something else, then you have to answer the question, what else? What is it? And if you can't answer that question, then there's no way to prove that it exists. And if there's no way to prove that it exists, there's no way to make it a scientific statement. You can go ahead and believe in it anyway. That's an option. But then what you have is a belief, and just a belief. It's not science. And maybe you're okay with that. Maybe you don't even care about science. And that's probably okay for you. But for me personally, it's not okay. Because personally, I think that the scientific approach to thinking is fundamental to the way that human intellect should work, as evidenced by the fact that science evolved out of classical Vedic schools of thought, Sankhya, Vaisheshika, and Nyaya. So then what's the bottom line? Is astrology pseudoscience after all? Well, scientists definitely seem to be very convinced that it is. But let's examine their conviction for a second. It turns out that the way scientists arrive at this negative conclusion of astrology is actually an embarrassment to their intellectual integrity. First of all, it's a heinous embarrassment for anyone to betray their own mother. And that is exactly what modern science is doing by denigrating astrology. Second of all, it's embarrassing for any scientist to reach a conclusion prematurely. In fact, it's a childish blunder for anyone to reject a proposal before understanding it. But again, that's exactly what modern science is doing with astrology. They say there's no mechanism by which the planets can affect us like astrologers say they do, without realizing that astrology does not even claim that the positions and motions of stars and planets affect our behavior. Or do we? See, and that's really the sad part. Sure, it's annoying or sad that scientists don't fully and really understand astrology. But that's understandable. I don't fully really understand physics. The really sad part is if a physicist doesn't understand physics. And similarly, what's really a shame is that we don't really understand astrology. Honestly, it's our fault that scientists don't understand astrology, because we're the people who are supposed to defend and represent it, but we don't know what it is. How many of you watching this right now realize that astrology is not based on the idea that the positions and motions of stars and planets affect human behavior here on Earth? Honestly, most of you probably think astrology is exactly based on that specific idea, right? So why do so many of us think that astrology is about how planets affect us? It's because we just accept whatever we hear. That's our tendency. And what do we hear? We hear whatever is being said the loudest and the most often. And is that always the most accurate thing? Not really. So let's be specific. What exactly did we hear about astrology when we were first introduced to it? Well, most of us were fed some variation on Ptolemy's idea. Ptolemy's idea that planets affect people. And what did we do? We gobbled up that prepackaged TV dinner because we're hungry and it's the only food in the house. But how many of you quietly wondered to yourself why these potatoes taste a little bit like aluminum? How many of you watching this right now realize that Ptolemy literally just made stuff up to make astrology sound impressive to physicists? Some of you watching right now are Vedic astrologers or fans of Vedic astrology. How many of you watching right now realize that Ptolemy's concept completely contradicts the native and essential Vedic concepts of karma and kartavya? Some of you watching right now are into Western astrology. How many of you realize that Ptolemy derailed your tradition and led it into a train wreck? Western astrology never embraced this mumbo-jumbo pseudoscientific causal mechanism until Ptolemy stumbled onto the scene and tried to make it sound like physics. The Babylonian and Egyptian foundations of Western astrology did not operate on such a silly pseudoscientific model, nor did any Greek before Ptolemy. The very word astrology tells us that it is not based on a causal mechanism. Astrology means sky words or information in the heavens. So the positions and motions of stars and planets does not affect people. The positions and motions of stars and planets are words written in the sky by the universe itself. And like words, they convey information. They do not mechanistically cause events. If you really love astrology, the most important thing that you can do for it right now is to stop believing in Ptolemy's mistake. Now, not everything that Ptolemy wrote is bad, but this particular idea that there's a causal mechanism by which planets literally affect humans is a bad idea. It's a very, very, very bad idea. If you love astrology and want to see it flourish and improve in the future, the most important thing you can do right now is to stop thinking that planets cause any behavior or events. So what should you think then? What are the planets doing if they're not causing my behavior and events? What is the relationship between human events and planetary positions? Here it is. Human events are propelled by human actions. Actions cause changes. Change unfolds with time and is inseparable from time. And the positions of planets in the sky measure and describe the progress of time. Planetary positions therefore describe time, which describes change, which describes actions and events here on Earth. This is the original mechanism proposed by astrology. Is it a scientific model? It very well might be. And one thing that we can say for certain right from the start is that unlike Ptolemy's model, it's not unscientific. Why not? Because it doesn't violate any principles we see operating in the world. And it doesn't rely on any principles that we've never experienced and don't even know exist. So what is astrology really? Is it really the ways planets and stars affect us? No, it's not. Astrology is the language of the sky, a language spoken by time, describing itself. The better we understand this language, the better we can understand time, which means past, present, and future. So now we've replied to Wikipedia's entire summary or introduction to their scientific critique of astrology. We'll continue into the body of this article in episode 4, which will go into more detail about the ideas and the specifics that have been summarized so far. So please be sure to go through the description below the video to find a link to transcripts, to astrological readings that I offer, and to my books, especially this one particular book I would recommend on this subject. It's called The Beautifully Rational Philosophy of Astrology. It explains everything that we're talking about in this video in a nice written way that's very easy to understand. Thank you so much for your time.